Listen to the stories. We cried and we laughed. Lessons from our history, but not of how we go back. Cause we strive to move forward, a vision of what we can be. Full is our circle, complete is you and me. And we'll fill it with love, and we'll fill it with joy, and we'll fill it with pride. A vision of what we can be. My first Alaskans, my first Alaskans, my first Alaskans. I love you. Hand in hand, shift of a paradigm. What's the answer? Maybe in the land. 10,000 years we met as beautiful native tribes. We didn't start this fire, but we kept it in the dark times in your mind. My first Alaskans, my first Alaskans, my first Alaskans. I love you, I love you, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. I love you, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. My first Alaskans, I love you. I love you. Listen to the stories. We cried and we laughed, and the time is now.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. What an incredible way to begin today's webinar with the beautiful Our Stories. My name is Kelly Maxwell, and I use the pronouns she and her. I serve as Assistant Dean for Undergraduate Education at the University of Michigan, and I'm also the chair of the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar and live streaming on Facebook and provide some brief remarks on behalf of the DDNRC. First, let me acknowledge where we are, where each of us is. We are all in different places, spaces, and on different lands. We here at the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center, the organization that brings us together today, are based on the lands of the Georgia tribe of Eastern Cherokee and the Lower Muskogee Creek tribe. We acknowledge that we are all sitting on Indigenous lands, ancestral lands, and unceded lands of Native peoples. These lands continue to be of great importance to Indigenous tribes and their familial descendants of these bands of people. We recognize that we continue to benefit from the use and occupation of these lands. We recognize that we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible our colleges, universities, and organizations' relationship to Native peoples, and to join with them to do the work necessary to ensure equity and justice for Indigenous peoples in the US and all across the world. In giving a land acknowledgement, we must also recognize that saying these words are not enough, but let these words be a start, a naming of truth, an acknowledgement of where we truly are. By beginning here, it sets the course for us to move forward. We invite you to consider the lands on which you reside and work, and we invite you to reflect, to know the histories of Indigenous peoples, and to know the current and present state of Native peoples in your region, and to help us think about what's more, what comes after land acknowledgements in our relationships to Indigenous peoples and the impact that our place continues to have on them. So today I welcome you to our conversation beyond land acknowledgements, featuring a panel of tribal leaders from a variety of nations who you will be introduced to in a few minutes. We began this discussion last fall with 2 webinars, excuse me, on decolonizing academe. And we understood then that more dialogue was necessary to bring a fuller understanding of decolonization within our institutions. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center to you, which is the primary sponsor of today's event. We are an organization that seeks to contribute to transformative change among higher education institutions and their partners by advancing innovative dialogic practices to address the multiple and persistent challenges to justice and equity. More than ever, the nation is in critical need of tools and capacities for engaging with one another. Over the last year and a half, we at the DDNRC have hoped to reimagine dialogue by inviting scholars and activists to share their knowledge and practices with our wider DDNRC community. Their sharing has helped us to examine our own practice and develop shared spaces to respond to the calls for racial justice and decolonization in and outside of higher education. We also offer monthly community of practice meetings where colleagues from around the country discuss tools and strategies for difficult dialogues on their own campuses. And we also regularly share skill building practices as well as suggested dialogue topics through our newsletters, and we welcome you to sign up for our mailing list at difficultdialogues.org, the top right-hand corner. As we begin this webinar, I also want to acknowledge and thank our other institutional partners for their support of this important work. The University of Pennsylvania School of Arts and Sciences and the University of Alaska Anchorage. And so now I turn it over to Dr. Bridget Dwyer, who will give a brief welcome from the University of Pennsylvania.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And Kelly, thank you for your wonderful introduction. And wow, I agree. What a way to start with such a fantastic video. Thanks to our friends and colleagues and those we know and don't know for creating such a wonderful video and start to this program. I'm Bridget Dwyer. I'm Vice Chair of the DDNRC, and I serve as Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm thrilled that so many people have been able to join us today to be challenged and to move our conversations, as Kelly mentioned, beyond land acknowledgements. To our Alaskan colleagues, we are honored to be here. Thank you for allowing us to listen to your family conversation. We hope that today's conversation is just one of many that will continue across the country about moving beyond land acknowledgements into authentic conversations and engagement with Indigenous communities where we live and work. At the University of Pennsylvania, we certainly plan to continue this engagement. And for those of you here from UPenn, I want to recognize the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative and the tremendous leadership of Marge Bruchak as a coordinator. Please visit the NAIS website to learn more. We'll drop that in the chat in just a moment. And you can learn more about NAIS at the website, as well as faculty advisors and the students who contribute to this community. And finally, I'd like to thank the great work of the students, the natives at Princeton, the natives at Penn organization, the Natives at Penn organization for creating awareness of Native and Indigenous culture, history, and enhancing the visibility of Native and Indigenous students. I'm very new to the Penn community, and so I look forward to partnering with you all. And now I'd love to turn it over to Libby from the University of Alaska Anchorage. Thank you all.
Thank you. Hi, and welcome everybody. Also, my name is Libby Roderick. I am the director of the Difficult Dialogues Initiative at the University of Alaska Anchorage and a co-founder and board member of the DDNRC. My university sits on the traditional and unceded lands of several Indigenous nations, the Dena'ina, the Atna-Dene, the Iñupiaq, the Unangan, the Kanaitsi, the Chugachmute, and the Iñupiaq. And I just want to offer my personal gratitude as a lifelong Alaskan. My own life has been informed and transformed by the generosity, the genius, the knowledge, the wisdom of Indigenous nations, cultures, peoples, individuals up here. And the elders up here, the Native elders up here call the dominant society the reverse society, where we have most things upside down and backwards. And so many things that are of critical importance get backgrounded deeply and made invisible, while so many things that are foregrounded are actually not that important and sometimes damaging. And in my opinion, that invisibility is a central piece of Indigenous oppression, which is why, one of many reasons why an event like this is so critical. And at a time where the dominant way of living has really brought the future of humanity as well as the living world entire into question, in my opinion, it is way past time for us to elevate and listen to the voices of people who have thousands of years of brilliance to share with us about everything from how best to raise and educate our children to how to be in right relationship with the living natural world. And those things are, of course, profoundly connected. So one of the things we really can do is to start to listen to the voices of Indigenous people who are of necessity walking in both worlds, or two worlds, or more than two worlds, and who, in my opinion, see the most clearly of any peoples that I know where and how we need to change things to ensure justice and equity for all and to ensure a living future for all of our children. So I cannot be more thrilled, particularly on Valentine's Day. This is a Valentine from my standpoint, to offer to this audience. It's a national and an international audience. I know there are a lot of you out there, some of you joining us on the webinar, some of you, I hope, joining us on the Facebook Live feed, to listen to some of the most powerful Indigenous voices from where I am and where we are in the world up here in Alaska. There are almost 600 Indigenous nations in the US alone. And so I want to offer and extend a particular welcome to those of you participants who are attending from those nations, knowing that you have a world of things to share, knowledge and wisdom to share yourselves. There are 7 major Indigenous nations in Alaska, continuing to live on their ancestral lands. And 3 of those nations are represented today amongst our presenters. Amongst our 4 presenters, all of whom are brave and brilliant activists, educators, thinkers, and leaders in Alaska and beyond. So their experiences are going to be largely Alaska specific, but the insights and the lessons that they share are, of course, transferable to a multitude of contexts, both inside and outside of higher ed. So our panelists will introduce themselves. The conversation will be moderated, and I hope also joined by Ayyu Qassataq, a passionate, talented, fiercely committed mother, an activist, educator. She is the vice president of First Alaskans Institute, a policy and think tank for Indigenous peoples in Alaska. She's an advocate for her people, for Indigenous peoples across Alaska, for Indigenous peoples everywhere, and indeed peoples everywhere. And I could not be more thrilled to hand it over to you, Ayyu.
Thank you so much, Libby. What a beautiful introduction. Uŋalaqłiq. Oh, I guess it's Uŋalaqłiq. Right now in Alaska, we are just past noon. I know that we're calling from different times across the nation and world. Ayyu Qassataq, Iñupiaq, Talialuk, Qassataq, Doug and Kutuukhuq, Herdman, Kutuukhuq, Talialuk, Qanigluk, and Inuaałuuraq. I'm Ayyu Qassataq. I'm Iñupiaq. I come from Uŋalaqłiq, also known as Uŋalaqłiq. I currently live, work, and raise my 4 amazing children on Dena'ina lands in Uŋalaqłiq. As Libby mentioned, I currently serve as Vice President for First Alaskans Institute, a statewide Alaska Native advocacy organization that I've been very honored to work with and for almost 12 years now. I want to acknowledge the Dena'ina peoples on whose lands First Alaskans Institute has our kind of home base, though we're a statewide organization, and want to say as an individual Iñupiaq woman that with thousands of years of abundant stewardship over these lands, the Dena'ina and Ahtna peoples, that I fully support the return of land back to their effective and balanced stewardship. And I hope that each of you in everywhere you are, recognizing that you too are on Indigenous land, that if you are not already familiar with land back and what that means and what it doesn't mean, that you take the opportunity to learn more about that and how you can help be an effective advocate in that way. Before I invite my family on to introduce themselves for our session as well, I want to acknowledge that while we were given the honorific of tribal leader in our introduction, none of us currently represent our tribes. That's a very specific connotation for our peoples. And I think rather we consider ourselves individuals who carry a lot of responsibility for our peoples, and we are tribal citizens as well. So I would love to call onto the screen my family that'll be joining me today. As was mentioned by Bridget earlier, really this is an opportunity for us to have a family conversation with each other that everyone else gets to listen in on, and hopefully will help create space for this conversation to grow across our country and world. So I'd love to invite Ayyu, if you can come on and introduce yourself.
All right, Masitcho Ayyu Shalaknai Shijanai Shojrit Charlene Sternoji Shitsu Maggie Dinjiju Shojrit Iltsai Haiju Shahna Vashaiko Gwetslan Eatley Shiahanai Peter Stearns Florence Newman Gavojri. So good morning, everybody. My name is Charlene Stern. My Gwich'in Athabascan name is Haiju, which means baby goose. I am originally from the community of Vashaiko, or Arctic Village, Alaska. I currently work at the University of Alaska Fairbanks as the Vice Chancellor for Rural Community and Native Education. That includes 2 colleges, 5 rural campuses, and a number of learning sites throughout our state. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm working on the ancestral lands of Talialuk, which is home to the Lower Tanana and Dene people of the interior. Their stewardship of these lands for thousands of years makes my work at UAF possible today. I also serve in tribal leadership as the Vice President for Tanana Chiefs Conference, which is a tribal consortium of 37 federally recognized tribes in interior Alaska, and I am an enrolled member of the Native Village of Inuit tribal government. So welcome everyone, and thank you for participating in our panel.
Qanigluk, Dr. Stern. I'd love to invite Dr. Black on to introduce herself.
Dringwinzi, everyone. Good afternoon. Shojri Jessica Blackoji Gwachaje Gwatsan Itli Gatanan Gwichi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Black, and my family is from Gwachaje, Fort Yukon, but I, like Dr. Stern, live and reside on the traditional homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene, the Chinahultani, here on and work on Talialuk campus. I'm very grateful and reminded every day that I come to campus of their long-term stewardship, past, present, and future. And I currently serve as an associate professor in the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development, and also tribal governance. And my work centers around the relationship between governance and well-being, especially as it pertains to natural resources stewardship, or as many of us call our relatives, salmon, caribou, moose, all waters, lands. And a lot of that work entails having racial equity dialogues and centering Indigenous knowledge to its rightful place in institutions of higher education. So really grateful to be here with you all. Thank you for coming, and we're going to have an awesome dialogue together. Thank you.
Merci, Cho sisters. Kahuku, I'd love to invite you in to introduce yourself.
Kachish, Ayyu, Koyana. Kahuku, Yakat Duasak, take Wadiakat, Quashkakwan, Yadiakat, Yakta Kwanachat. My fligant name is Kutuukhuq. That's a Tequidi, a brown bear name from Yakutat. I'm a child of the Quashkakwan. Streaming today, though, from Occoquan, which is also in Tlingit country in our capital city. Coming to you from my brown bear cave, I guess, my den here in Juneau. I'm chairman of the board at Sea Alaska. Had a career in higher ed, and happy Valentine's Day to everybody. I'm excited just to be here with the family, sharing space on this special day, and looking forward to having a very difficult dialogue here. So Gunus Cheese to everybody for joining us today.
Yeah, happy Valentine's Day. I can think of no better group to spend with, folks that I love so much, having a conversation about things that are really important to us that we know others need to engage with. So Qanigluk to each of you for responding to the call for us to have this family conversation in public so that others can engage with it. I want to acknowledge that this topic, beyond land acknowledgements, really extends far beyond us as individuals, us within our cultural groups and Alaska, that there are Indigenous peoples across the entire world who have their own experiences that are locally based, that we represent our own individual experiences, though we have, as has been mentioned, a lot of experience in terms of advocating with and for our peoples beyond our own. But I want to just acknowledge the fact that, you know, Native peoples, Indigenous peoples are not monolithic. Even within our own cultural groups, distinct cultural groups, we have our own good thinking that we contribute to the discourse of our world, and that we don't represent all Indigenous people's ideas around the things that we'll be talking about. So I want to acknowledge that and extend an invitation to you to engage with the people on whose land that you are on, if you are not already, to build relationship with them, and to engage in what it means to build meaningful relationship around these topics and so many others. So over the course of, one other thing that I wanted to say related to that. As I was preparing to log on, I was reflecting on how 90 minutes will go by wicked fast. It will go by so fast. It already is going by really fast, right? And when it comes to topics of acknowledging the true history that so often is not taught, it places an undue burden on us as Indigenous peoples to try and catch everyone up with the things that we haven't learned. And so I want to acknowledge that and acknowledge a dynamic that a sister in this work, Dr. Twyla Baker Mandan Hiratsa, of North Dakota and her colleagues coined a term that they said is translation exhaustion. And that is this dynamic that happens with Indigenous, and I would say also BIPOC peoples, of feeling this urgency to explain our history all the way back through colonization in order to catch everyone up to the current day so that we can be having the same conversation, and to be placed in a position of continually trying to catch everyone up is incredibly exhausting. And like I said, puts undue burden on us. And so I want to acknowledge that this conversation is going to be everything it needs to be for this conversation. I know there will be additional sessions that are scheduled for others to engage in. There is a Q&A function in the webinar format for you to be able to place questions as is appropriate. We may weave some of those in, but all of the questions will be gathered and will help to inform the future sessions around this topic. So just want to lay some of that groundwork. So this is a conversation that we're going to be having. We know each other well, we love each other, we care about each other's work, we uplift each other in a lot. I want to acknowledge Dr. Stern and Dr. Black. They served on my graduate committee recently and really helped me get through my graduate program. So we support each other in so many ways. And so I just want to open up the conversation. Anyone who wants to jump right in to talk about, you know, as Indigenous peoples, what are some of the impressions of how this increasing practice of providing land acknowledgements has been beneficial or not? Anyone want to open it up?
I can share a little bit. Thank you, Ayyu, for bringing us together and for all of the work that you've done for a long time in hosting difficult dialogues. I was actually trained by Ayyu to host racial equity dialogues, and I'm very grateful for that because it really has elevated the work. With the land acknowledgements, you know, I know there's been discussion on both sides of land acknowledgements, those discussions that are really supportive and positive, and then those discussions that are, it's not enough just to do a land acknowledgement if, you know, we don't actually uplift Indigenous sovereignty and the work moving forward. For me, I think one positive thing I've seen is here at UAF Talialuk campus is that providing land acknowledgements has created a space for people to better understand whose land this is. And I say this is present because in my mind, I'm actually looking at a picture of Chief Peter John, the late Chief Peter John right in front of me. And he's the one that really talked about this very important place of learning, Talialuk. And it's really positioned people to learn more about the people of this place. I'm very grateful because I'm from Fort Yukon, but I was raised in Nenana, Alaska, just 60 miles down the highway from Fairbanks, home of the Lower Tanana Dene. And the people have taught me so much throughout my lifetime. And there's so much complexity and beauty and knowledge embedded within Lower Tanana Dene people. So providing land acknowledgement really helps people to research, to ask questions, to better understand whose land they're on. It also has done something, I believe, that maybe was or wasn't intended, and that it's made visible all the Native people, students, staff, faculty that work and attend this campus, right? So by acknowledging land acknowledgements, you're acknowledging the presence and existence of Indigenous people, which is a lot of times made invisible in our society. And so I think while it's just one step forward, it's not the step forward. I think it has done some really positive things. Now, I do think that moving forward, we have a lot more work to do. And And I'll be happy to share more later, but I just wanted to start off with that. Thank you.
All right, well, I'll jump in next. I always looked at Joe, see which one of us is gonna go for the mic first. So, I think, of course, Dr. Black and I work at the same institution. And so a lot of what she shared are, things that I believe as well. It's interesting when you kind of take a step back, when you think about land acknowledgements and how popular they've really become and how much attention they've gotten. I can't even say what really prompted the movement, because from a tribal perspective, to offer such an acknowledgement is something that most of us were brought up with, right? Like whenever I visit a different place, it was taught to me that you acknowledge that you are a guest on somebody else's territory, and you state that in a welcoming. And oftentimes you also bring gifts and stuff to honor the people in the place. So there's this whole ceremony that follows that type of a protocol. And so that was something that I was familiar with. But this new context of acknowledging the land and the people and the relationship within organizations, and particularly institutions of higher education, is really, I feel like, more new. And I think, like Dr. Black said, it has really challenged, I think, people within these institutions to recognize, one, that no matter where you are, could be at home, in a car, in your place of work, in your place of school, you are likely on Indigenous lands. And I think that awareness wasn't necessarily there before. Not to say that everybody gets it now, but certainly I think before people felt like, oh, I had to go to a reservation, right? And that's when I was on Native lands. But the reality is that all of these lands were occupied and stewarded by Indigenous peoples, no matter where you were. And so I think that acknowledgement's really important, but also with that comes a relational responsibility. It's understanding that you wouldn't have the privilege of being on these lands and utilizing these lands in the state that they are if it weren't for that caretaking, that careful caretaking by all those Indigenous peoples for so many generations. And as a temporary kind of user and steward of these lands, you have a responsibility to leave them in better shape maybe than you found them, or to at least maintain some integrity of those places. And I think that's really an important part of the land acknowledgement. I also think that land acknowledgements are kind of on a spectrum in general. You have ones that sort of maybe just do a brief acknowledgement of the peoples that stewarded that place. And then you have ones like, I looked up one from Heritage University in Washington, and there's, I'll read you a little bit of an excerpt. There's a lot more to it, but it says, "We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community on this land. We acknowledge that our university's history, like many others, is fundamentally tied to the first colonial developments in the Yakima Valley. Finally, we respectfully acknowledge and honor past, present, and future Indigenous students who will journey through this home called Heritage University." So I think there's kind of this spectrum of like acknowledging, whose land we're on, to actually acknowledging those rights and those, they even referenced the treaties that were engaged with Native people. So, that's something to think about, I think, for anybody who's interested in land acknowledgements too, is how far do you go in that acknowledgement? It's really meaningful, I think, for our people.
Sheesh. This is kindergarten level stuff. As Dr. Stern mentioned, some of us just grew up with this kind of understanding about how you relate and look at the world, and just acknowledge people. In Southeast, we're connected by the water. We're all ocean-going people here, and you'd often wait offshore to be welcomed in. And a lot of our songs and groups that perform and dance in our traditional ways, we have outside songs that you sing while you're outside, waiting to be invited in. So it's just embedded in us, but it's fifth grade stuff. And not fifth grade, I said kindergarten stuff. and I'm going straight to education because, we've got a lot of highly educated people by definition just in this conversation that had their whole careers to get that PhD and then land a job at Big U and still not know whose land they're standing on. So it's just incredible that it's an awesome way to get this consciousness level increased right now. The benefit I see is the next step of the Native community just around the world seizing the moment, because that acknowledgement is just one step. Next step is grab the microphone, share a little bit. And then, there's going to obviously be bigger steps right after that, so that we're going to get into here. So it's a good consciousness raising that I think is, well, obviously it's just long overdue. But like I said, this is kindergarten level stuff. So it's something that hopefully, we don't need too many more generations of PhD level people getting to that level without having this basic understanding about the world.
To each of you, I think I'm hearing that it's not enough to acknowledge. It has to be paired with action. Sometimes that action can be uncomfortable, right? When it comes to, asking simple questions like, how come I was born and raised in this place and I'm only now as an adult starting to understand whose land it's on? Haiju, when you were talking about the spectrum of land acknowledgements, there was a meme that popped into my mind. Maybe you guys have seen it. It's a meme. It's a white passing person who has their face kind of tilted up into the sun, and they have this look on their face of just contentment. And it says, when you give a land acknowledgement but still get to keep the land. And something I love about our Native people is our humor and our ability to use humor to understand the issues, the complex issues that we experience as Native people. And, I keep hearing thematically already around how land acknowledgement does provide a method of increasing visibility, something that is often invisibilized. But I want to tease something out a little bit more as well around the spectrum of land acknowledgements that are given. And that is that if not done correctly and accurately, land acknowledgements can also be a form of erasure. They can also hide the true history of a place. Sometimes when I hear land acknowledgements, I'll hear people acknowledge the first peoples and thank them for welcoming us settlers onto that space. And in the back of my mind, I'm always wondering, is that true? Were you welcomed into this space? Is that the truth of the history of this place? And if it's not, then that deserves some careful thought and reflection. So as we're kind of digging into the opportunities that are embedded within acknowledging the first peoples of a place, I think it opens up conversation around the true histories that are associated with Indigenous peoples and education institutions, right? So I want to open it up and just ask, what are some conversations that you are experiencing or observing around conversations starting to bubble up within colleges and universities related to the relationship with Native peoples of that place?
I'll start this time. I think one that's coming to consciousness at the same time here, or right on the heels of this, is residential schools. And as Native people, we all know all too well, you know, that there's this movement acknowledging and recognizing our grandparents who survived residential schools, which is just horrific when you think about schools. And we're trying to survive getting through school, literally. And remains of our grandparents and ancestors that were just, you know, that are being excavated right now and returned home. And that conversation's happening, you know, with our friends over in the First Nations and a bit over in the United States. And that's a difficult, you know, that's a tough one. So, but as far as challenges, I agree that there is a big risk here about just continuing to be tokenized, you know, to the degree we have Indigenous people, Native people that are among the ranks of, you know, faculty or staff in higher education or wherever it is in the mainstream. You know, if you're acknowledged at all, it's often just the token checking the box. And then there is a lot put on your shoulders to catch people up. So it's I guess being tokenized or trivialized or then commoditized, you know, to some degree on that, because at the other end of the spectrum, there are lots of folks out there that are all of a sudden now Indigenous or Native, or, you know, they didn't necessarily grow up that way, no one at all or something, but when they fill out their college application, all of a sudden, oh, I got a grandmother there somewhere, great grandmother. And a lot of folks claiming to be Indigenous or Native, and it's become a thing that's happening, you know, all over. So the whole spectrum of pitfalls are really definitely creating a complicated thing where we're going to have many more dialogues to muddle through some of them. And we definitely do appreciate the allies and the folks who get it and who are willing to engage, though. And it's not about us; it's about all of us, because we're not on a great course right now as a civilization, as a planet, and it's our own grandparents' knowledge and wisdom that needs to come to the forefront here to really help settle things down and get things on a better path.
I'll jump in. Yeah, something that Joe mentioned, I think is a real thing, which is that Indigenous peoples all of a sudden find ourselves trending. We were all Indigenous before it was cool, and now that we're cool, we don't know what to do with it. You know, it's just so interesting to me, because we've all struggled with our experiences of racism and just you name it. You know, within all these institutions of education, policy, everything. And so now to all of a sudden have this level of attention is interesting. You know, I think one of the things that in some of the university circles that I've been a part of, one of the questions is, when is land acknowledgement appropriate, right? Like, is it in official university documents? Is it appropriate on a web page? Is it appropriate for all kinds of addresses by leadership? Is it appropriate in an email signature line? Like, where does it start and where does it end? Even just in terms of those statements, I think is something that people kind of struggle with. And it just seems like there's kind of a lack of general guidance out for people who really want to do the practice and do it in a good way, but don't really know how. And so that's something that we just talk about internally often. But I think in terms of a bigger picture, you know, one of the challenges of land acknowledgements and the practice, we've talked about it here, is just it's almost too easy, right? It gives people like this sort of false confidence that they're really supporting Indigenous peoples and our issues without really stepping into the work. And I know tons of well-meaning people who are really interested in land acknowledgements, incorporating them into their introductions and that sort of thing. And I think those gestures are fine, and they aren't totally devoid of meaning, but they aren't the same thing as being an ally. like Joe said, being a strong ally to Indigenous peoples requires a much higher degree of commitment. It requires a deeper awareness of our people, our history, our cultures, our experiences, and also, an understanding of colonization and the many ways that it continues to harm our people. It also requires, I think, some self-reflection on the part of the individual to understand that likely everything that they've ever been taught or conditioned to think and know about us is flawed, right? So that's really the next stage of allyship to me beyond these gestures.
Yeah, thank you both for your reflections. I'm just taking notes too, because we never stop learning, right? That's something we're taught in our Indigenous cultures, is we learn from the time we're born, just cyclically. So thank you for your words. I in some of the work I'm doing around racial equity and salmon management is definitely moving beyond land acknowledgements. I'm actively pushing and requesting that my colleagues and my people in my institution roll up their sleeves and actively do work to dismantle racism, bring forth Indigenous peoples and their respective knowledge systems into the academy where everyone can learn, not just Indigenous people, and promote equity. And that's not an easy thing to do. I am fortunate that I have found some really strong allies in the work who are working within their own circles with their own colleagues to better understand colonization and how it plays out in the classroom or in just even the art and representation of a place. But I also rely very much on my Indigenous brothers and sisters, such as the people on this webinar, to for counsel and support and pushing systems at larger levels that make this place a better place for me to work, because I cannot do it otherwise. I cannot do the work because there's so few of us here and there's so much work to be done. And I'm also working to be 100% for my students, right? So they don't have to enter the classroom and do the work of educating their professors or their classmates on Indigenous peoples of this place of, equity and salmon management. So I'm actively pursuing. I feel like time has already gone too far in my life. I feel like I'm rapidly, working to do my part in challenging the systems and bringing forth our elders and our Indigenous scholars and making not just a little tiny bit of a space, but like an equitable space. And everybody is learning, not just Indigenous people. So land acknowledgement to me on the spectrum, so there's a spectrum of land acknowledgements, and then there's like a spectrum of, equity work. It's like on one side of the spectrum, and then we're pushing systems and peoples to step up, to learn, do their own self-reflection and work, as Dr. Stern shared. And also one important part I wanted to add is here at the university, we have lots of Indigenous students. So just making space and forums and platforms for them to share their knowledge, because they come from rich, vibrant cultures from all over, and that those knowledges need to be shared. So that's some of where I'm going in my work.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that you brought in talking about the urgency of embedding equity in this work, and I want to speak to that briefly. You know, so many people equate, this is going to get confusing, think that equality and equity are the same thing. And that's highly problematic when it comes to what we're experiencing in our school systems. You know, if you think of equality as treating everyone exactly the same, and then equity as, you know, making sure that people have the supports they need to attain success at the same rate, I guess is one way of putting it. When you apply an equality approach where you're treating everyone the same, but historically there have been harms that have created disenfranchisement for some of us, that is just going to continue perpetuating this inequity that we experience. One of the ways that I experienced that personally was as a Native person, trying to understand the history of my own community. You know, I come from Uŋalaqłiq, Iñupiaq. We're the southernmost Iñupiaq community in Alaska. We have a lot of Iñupiaq family. We were also right along the borderline of Iñupiaq, Iñupiaq, and Inuaałuuraq folks. And so we have a really rich history throughout time, but when it came to understanding how things have come to be the way that they are in our community, where our own ancestral traditions are currently sleeping, I was having a really difficult time trying to piece together what happened. How come within my community there is not our traditional singing and dancing and some of our ancestral practices? And you know, I came to find that there was a lot of miseducation about the history. And so, you know, the timing and everything aligned for me to go back to school. Part of it was because as I was doing my own research to learn about this history, a lot of the knowledge that had been extracted from my community by researchers like in the 60s and 70s, when our practices were still intact in many ways, was that it was privileged into the institution. I couldn't even access it as a member of the community unless I was a student or faculty of UAF. And I knew inherently that that was unjust. Like, why is that knowledge locked up behind the walls of the university? And it wasn't until I entered into the program that I'm so thankful is run by, you know, really incredible Indigenous peoples like Kaiju, like Dr. Black, that I had to kind of reckon with the enormity of the miseducation I had received, and also kind of piecing together the history of the education system in Alaska, understanding historically how missionization of Native people went hand in hand with the formation of an education system. And the express purpose of both was to kill the Indian to save the man, right? To assimilate Native people. And so within Alaska, the formation of the education system was explicitly to weaponize a system to remove us from our knowledge. And where I was experiencing levels of the grieving that I was going through as a Native person in that program was to reckon with the fact that the education system itself had been complicit in removing this knowledge from our people, removing us from ourselves, and that I, as an adult, was utilizing the same system to try and recover it. And it reminded me of Dr. Lance Twitchell's, his quote. He said, they extracted the knowledge from us concentrated, and now they're selling it back to us diluted. And to reckon with that as a Native student, and to dive into the history books, which were written by people who did not love us, to encounter and try and untangle and understand our history through an Inuk lens. To understand what has happened to us was quite a journey. I know that, there's a wealth of experience on this screen of working within the institutions, the education institutions that serve our people, that include our people. And so I want to open up some conversation around, what do you wish non-Native people knew about the experiences of our Native students in these institutions? What do you wish non-Native people knew about the experiences of Native people working within these institutions? And I'll kick it over to Dr. Black first, because I know she's going to have to step away here in just a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about what you just shared, Ayyu, and just how deep and profound the words you shared are, and thinking back to your journey, but then your journey helped me think about my own journey, and just want to thank you for sharing that. We and Dr. Stern can correct me, but so something like 80% of incoming Alaska Native freshmen leave within their first year. And I've just ever since, well, before that statistic came into my mind, I've always just held that so close to my heart, questioning like what and why and what can I do to make this space, this campus, more inclusive and safe and welcoming place. And so I've just really volunteered for any committee and any, Dr. Stern and I were co-advisors for a Native student group, just educating myself on like what keeps students, what leads them to leave. And I think there's common narratives around underpreparedness or just a host of other things why Native students leave. But I also started to learn that it was things like just how they're greeted when they arrive to campus, like what sort of representation is around campus. Is it art that represents their peoples from their specific place, or any sort of Native representation? Is it a feeling of safety when you put on your parka and you walk across campus? Is it the does the classroom space include not only acknowledgement, but information and material that represents your people in a way that's not of the past, but living, vibrant cultures and the contribution. So, I think when we're as educators, I also hear, well, I'm not Native, so I can't really speak to those things, but everybody can educate themselves and everybody can take part in making a campus, a community, a more safe, inclusive, welcoming place, but also push the institution to do better, to put resources towards these things. So it's not an easy question for me because there's just so many things that I want people to know. I also want people to know that here in Alaska, we have over 200, I'm not sure the exact number, like 231 tribal governments. We have Alaska Native corporations, we have non-profits, corporations, and we have complex governing systems, and we have living, breathe, vibrant cultures that raise us up before we ever enter formal schools. So we come to these experiences as leaders, as knowledge holders, and we need the space to share some of those things. So I'll just stop there, but I mean, there's just so many things. And I hope somewhere in there was like a juicy bit of something you can hold on to as you enter in the classroom space.
Always the juicy bits, Dr. Black. I love learning from you, and I so value and appreciate the ways that you support our Native students. I honestly don't think I would have made it through the program if it were not for both you and Dr. Stern, as well as Qanigluk, Dr. Agatha John Shields. It makes a world of difference to have people in your corner who understand what it means to be a Native person traversing these systems. So, Uŋalaqłiq. And thank you for joining us. I know that we only got to have you for a short time, but I'm so glad that we did.
Well, I can say a few things. You know, I think as Native people, just like other people of color, you know, we can't avoid participating in Western institutions, right? It's just not an option. Those are the mainstream institutions of our society. And, you know, with that, I think we negotiate a lot away. There was speaking of memes, I mentioned a meme, I saw one that said something like, you know, white privilege is why my history is considered an elective and not a requirement, or something like that, right? And I think that's the reality that shapes the education system still to this day. You go to any physics class on campus, any chemistry class, any math class, and it's all, you know, virtually in English. It's all from a Western body of knowledge, you know, and I didn't even know that it didn't have to be normal until I went to Hawaii to an immersion school where I saw instructors teaching K-12 students, you know, mathematics in Hawaiian using language and models from that body of knowledge. It was incredible to me. And I just thought, wow, the power of the education system to make it seem like all of this is normal, right? When there are other bodies of knowledge out there to be drawn from and taught and learned is just incredible. So, you know, as a Native person that has attended 3 separate universities as a student, and then taking a position as a faculty and now working in higher ed administration, I think our people continue to be grossly misunderstood and often pathologized. And what I mean by that is when our people have difficulties in the system persisting, the problem is on the students. It's on their lack of preparation. It's on their family situation. It's on their intelligence. And it very rarely is ever looked at like a symptom of a much bigger problem, which is the systems themselves that have marginalized, excluded, and you know, perpetuated a lot of these issues. And so when you pathologize the student, then the remedy or the solution is to get them more support, right? It is like treating them like as if that's all they need. And it's a problem because it never actually calls on the institution to reflect on itself and the many ways in which it creates these inequities, right? So when you ask about, you know, what do I wish my non-Native colleagues knew about us? The first thing that came to my mind is just how amazing, how fun, and how brilliant our people are. I was thinking about, you know, when I go home to my village, one of the first things that happens, and it's not a conscious thing, is I really shed this persona that has been constructed over my 13 and a half years in higher education that, you know, allowed me to be successful in this institution. The way that I talk, the terminology that I use, the way that I communicate with people, that has all been learned and is part of our coping strategy of how we are able to succeed and be recognized in these, positions that we're in. So when we go back home, we start to shed that persona and we become more authentically who we are, who we were raised to be, like Dr. Black said, by our people. And I think about those as some of the best times because those are times spent with, people in their most sort of genuine and authentic selves. And I think about our students who have that experience as well when they come to the university and they participate in classes and they're forced to engage in these Western ways and the negotiating that has to happen within their own identities to be able to be successful in those spaces is really something that when you think about somebody who spends a whole lot of time in academia, it wears on you after a while and it gets tiring. So what I wish that more non-Native people would experience is our communities, our lands, our students in an environment where they're less guarded, where they can be more of themselves, because that is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And that's, to me, to try to create more spaces where students can still experience that freedom, that safety, like Dr. Black mentioned, on campus is what I'm all about. For me, when I was an undergrad, I went to a university where there wasn't that many Native students. And at that point, I had gone through an entire K-12 educational experience without having a single Native faculty or teacher in the classroom. And then I got it when I was a freshman in college. And that was just by happenstance that the university had attracted a new American Indian faculty member. And I remember his chair in his office being my safe place, right? And so now as leaders within the university system here in Alaska, I want more spaces like that chair was to me for our Native students.
Sheesh, it's quite the getting me fired up here and almost losing the prompts. But if there are any Bruins watching, because we're talking largely higher ed here, and what we want colleagues to know and understand or to take away here, I came out of Yakutat with a class of 11 in my class, but I ended up in Southern California at UCLA. So those are the Bruins I'm talking about. And if there are Bruins, here's something that they need to know: that there are more Indigenous remains in cardboard boxes in Haines Hall, in the basement of Haines Hall, than there are students on that campus. And that's the case for a lot of our institutions of higher ed. It's been the whole first part of the history of these fields of academia and the academy were founded on digging up our ancestors and studying our remains. So that's one more step, I guess, toward taking a step here beyond an acknowledgement. It's just, rolling up your sleeves a little more. So I think it's a great step towards becoming relevant, and that means relevant to us as people, as students on your campus. The fact is, when we enter these education institutions at the young ages and later, our brains are literally wired differently, and that's okay. That's just a fact, because we're collectivist based, we're group oriented, we communicate differently. You witness it even here. I think the communication styles with Indigenous folks are stand in stark contrast to the Western mainstream world on how we communicate. We listen a lot better. We observe a lot better. We don't need to talk in order to get our brains thinking and moving. And a lot of the rest of the world has to talk all the time. And for us, that's just that can have real consequences. If you're talking too much, if you're a super talker, that's generally frowned upon. But in the Western world, if you're a super talker, you're going to end up getting elected to something. And so there's all kinds of things to learn just about us. And one of them is just to sit back for a moment and try to understand, I don't know, what I've grown up to call the Tlingit pause. And it's not the brown bear pause, it's that pause, literally being comfortable in the silence in the moment for just a half a second longer to acknowledge your surroundings, which includes a lot of individuals. At the outset, Libby mentioned walking in two worlds, and that's been a phrase that we've heard for generations now, walking in two worlds. The reality is, because of these institutions, because of these systems that Dr. Stern was mentioning, we haven't been walking in two worlds. We've been stumbling through both of these worlds. We are, as a collective, incompetent in both worlds. And until we're able to unwind these things and to rebuild them based on our comfortable indigenousness, our comfortable home village self, that's where I was getting excited with Charlene, talking about going home. For most of us, you say go home, and then it's in positive endorphins that start going through you, and just your comfort of being home. And until these institutions can recreate that type of feeling in your brain and our student brains, we're not going to start moving forward. Yeah, lots of work to do. So, but I would, literally sit back and think about the brain science and the energy that's going on in any moment. And it's rare that we're not either doing good or it's rare that we're totally neutral. We're often bringing a negative energy, a very harmful energy, or something positive. And I think it's incumbent on all of us that are tuning into this right now to do our best to bring a positive energy into the effort here to create that safe space. But anyway, I got other lectures, but I need you to keep me on track here.
I could listen to you talk all day, Qanigluk, just like my sisters here. So, something that I'm reflecting on as I'm listening to you share about what we wish others knew, what's knocking on my heart is a story that was shared with us, has been shared with us in different public spaces from a Iñupiaq elder of ours who's still with us, Nelson Uŋalaqłiq of Talialuk. He has shared about his experience as a young Iñupiaq boy being sent to a mission school, which is one of the schools, like so many across Alaska and across the nation, that were intended to remove us from who we are as Native people. And they did that through a variety of ways. But he has shared about the first day that he went to school. Knowing only Yuchtun, his people's language, his Iñupiaq language, he was in the classroom and the teacher was speaking to the children in English and giving them direction in English. And she pointed at him and he stood up. And then she gave him direction in English and he couldn't understand what she was saying to him. And so he turned to a fellow student next to him, and in Yuchtun, he said, "Tell me what the teacher is saying." And she came over to him and she hit him so hard on his hands that it split the skin. And he has a scar to this day. He went home after that experience and he was talking to his grandpa. And he said, "As soon as I can, I'm going to leave this school. I can't do that anymore." And his grandpa was quiet. And he said, I was really hoping you would stay there long enough to learn their tongue so that you could tell them that we are real people. We are good people, people with feelings. And so he stayed in school. He said, if my grandpa had reacted in any other way, I wouldn't have. But that was how he responded. We need you to tell them that we are real people. You know, Indigenous peoples are the only ones who get the label of survivors making it through these education systems. You know, and sometimes there's this like glorification of our resiliency. Look how resilient they are. Our Native students are so resilient. Native people are so resilient without ever critically thinking, like Dr. Stern shared, critically thinking about what is it about our institutions and the way that we are doing this that's requiring their resilience? Why are these such difficult environments for our students? You know, it made me think of a meme, another meme of a plant that's just kind of like drooped over. And it says, when a plant is failing, you don't tell it it needs to do better. You don't ask it why it's not trying harder. You look at its soil. You look at how much it's being watered. Is it receiving enough sun? Too much sun? You try to find out what it is about the environment that is causing that plant to fail. And we need to upend the narrative around what's happening with our Native students in our schools, as if it's our Native students that are failing instead of our systems are failing Native students the most. And why is that? What is in our history that is not being brought to the surface that can help us understand that? You know, Lagunai, a sister in this work at First Alaskans Institute, she likes to bring in a quote from Jiddu Krishnamurti, an Indian scholar from, I think he was the 30s and 40s, who said, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So if our Native students are struggling in these systems, what is it about our system that is profoundly sick, that we are not responding well to? In fact, our lack of success in this Western context actually shows that we are still clinging to who we are. We are still connected to who we are, and we recognize that the system is not a healthy one for us. Another way of framing a question when it comes to working with our Native students is, how can we look to how successfully we support our white students? And how do we apply the ways that we are so successfully supporting them to all of our other students that are having a difficult time in our systems? So many different ways to, you know, take an angle on the thinking about and talking about these things. But as we're rounding our final lap already to the close of our time, I just want to open it up to each of you to be able to share anything that's on your heart, anything that you want to share with the folks who are tuned in.
I'll go ahead and start. First of all, I just really appreciate this conversation, and Masik Cho Ayyu for creating this space and the way that you did it. So, you know, being in this work and being in the academy and being in our communities kind of all at the same time, I just think that we have to acknowledge that while systems of higher education were not the only perpetrators of harm against our people, they certainly are among them. And it goes all the way back from building, you know, campus infrastructure on our lands, to letting systemic racism often go unchallenged within our institutions, to allowing many of our Indigenous communities to be experimented and researched on without informed consent. I mean, the list goes on how complacent we've been in all of this. And I think about, how do we move forward from that history, right? Like as institutions and as institutions that we have Native faculty and staff and students within. And I don't know that I have the answer, but I do want to say that, here in Alaska, First Alaskans Institute, which is the organization that Ayyu works for, they have these tribunals, which I think is a really powerful model because it basically creates a safe space where people could speak their truths. And I think when people do that, that healing naturally starts because they all of a sudden feel like they have a voice and they feel like they have something to say. And that's really important. I also think that universities play a really critical role in helping students to develop critical consciousness. We talked a little bit about that today. But I think, unfortunately, in a lot of K-12 environments, you learn content so that you can regurgitate it on a test or to write a paper about it. And it's less to think critically about the world. And I think that's where universities tend to do better. In my own case, I didn't know anything about my people's history until I went to college. And all of a sudden, I started to get more of a critical conscious developed. And so I think about what does that mean for all our people that don't go to college, where they never get that experience, right? We're very privileged in that sense, I think, in the academia to even experience those types of courses where that's encouraged, where discussion isn't super threatening. I also think that as universities, we really have to be real about the ways which we currently perpetuate harm against people and communities. And we really need to raise the standard that we accept from our faculty, from our staff, from our students. And I think that we can be models just in general for how to be less racist, to be anti-racist. UAF right now just made a commitment for all of our deans, directors, and administrators to go through a 6 months anti-racism training. That to me is progress. That to me says we're ready to roll up our sleeves and to really look at ourselves so that we can do better. And it's going to be a process, we know that, but it's got to start somewhere, and now is better than ever.
The final comments I guess I'll offer is thinking about these institutions. And as you move up the pyramid and look at the sort of the top of the food chain, I think over the last 20 years, a lot of our organizations and leadership has been slowly diversifying. You go back a few years, it's all, middle-aged white men essentially at the top of every organization. And now there's also plenty of middle-aged white females, but not a whole lot of diversity beyond that generally. And it made me think of that with Dr. Stern here at the UA system here in Alaska. I don't know if it's a first, I think it is, but at the UA system here in Alaska, even though we're more than 20% of the population, for the first time ever, we've got somebody in that executive circle who is from one of our communities. And that's just, it's I guess it's a benchmark. I don't know if it's something to celebrate or not, because at the same time you lament the fact that it took, so many years to get here. And we've yet to get there as far as the top job at any of our campuses, our universities for the CEO spot or the chancellor spot. And until we really start our students, our Indigenous students, start seeing themselves in those ranks, they have to come at it in the sense that the fight is on, and that they're going to be the ones that are going to break through that ceiling. And this is not just about institutional racism and a racial classification. That's the other thing that really needs to be well understood. Our status as a people, in Alaska, we've got the 229 federally recognized tribes. It's a political status, a legal status that's embedded in statutes, has reference in the Constitution. So it's the self-governance side of things really needs to be a spot where universities can dive in right now and help improve outcomes by just getting their heads around federal Indian law and the potential outcomes there that are all going to be positive when you have Indigenous leadership. Well, my close, I guess, is Ayyu talked about her home and the confluence of the Iñupiaq and the Iñupiaq and the Athabascans. My hometown was a different confluence of the Iñupiaq and the Tlingit and the Athabascan in Yakutat. And, this is something that's very real. I can't leave this without just reinforcing the power of our languages, our Indigenous languages, as somebody who's not fluent in my languages. My dad's side was Iñupiaq. His parents were both Iñupiaq. They were the last traditional Iñupiaq marriage. And my father and grandmother, they passed before I turned 10. But when I was a toddler, Iñupiaq was the first language in my household. And today, you're not going to find a living Iñupiaq person who speaks the language fluently. There's efforts, and I appreciate the champions who are keeping it alive. But it made me think the Academy, this was a book about the Iñupiaqs that a lot of that was pulled together in the 30s. And the primary source was my grandmother for a lot of that. And the reason she became the primary source was because there was one fellow in the community there who spoke English. And that was my grandfather, because he was kidnapped and shipped to Chimawa. He escaped one time and made it back home, but then they tracked him down again and kidnapped him and took him back down to Chimawa. So he actually spent 10 years down there in Oregon going to that boarding school. And as soon as he got back after that stint, he attempted suicide. And lucky for us, he was unsuccessful. So he lived and married my grandmother and had a few kids. But these histories are real and they're fresh. There needs to be another term. I doubt in our world that we would have a similar term to history. Because history, you think of in the Western terms, old stuff. For us, time really operates on a different continuum. And that's why we have to operate with a higher level of respect and reciprocity, just in general, every day, every moment, because we get that. So I want to thank you, Ayyu, and the team here for spending our Valentine's Day lunch together. So, sheesh.
Masicho to Ayyu and the fellow panelists and everybody listening. I think I'll just say that, I'm a process person, so of course I listen, and I'm just like reflecting on the words that you both shared, all of you. And I think the biggest thing for me right now is just making this space and making visible and real our Indigenous knowledge to, just to make space for it to be shared. And I am really privileged to have a grant along with Dr. Stern and Dr. Courtney Crothers, Dr. Peter Wesley. It's called the Mumpta, and it means all of us in the Sugpiaq and Yupik languages. And those students are getting their graduate degree in fisheries and STEM, in the STEM field. But one of the things that has been just so amazing, I mean, there's so many things, but one that just comes to mind is that the students come and they share from their perspectives and their knowledge systems. And like you said, Joe, these histories are real. And when they feel safe, they bring in their grandparents, like to class, they bring in their grandparents, or they bring a story or something that they remember. And they bring their languages, they bring their whole self to that space. And everybody benefits, everybody, no matter who you are. And so and that's truly the spirit of that word, damumta, all of us. So I really appreciate this time together. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make space to integrate what's been shared here, and to learn more about Indigenous peoples' histories, place, and do the decolonizing work. It's not up to just us on this webinar, it's up to all of us. So Masit Cho, thank you very much.
Uŋalaqłiq so much for sharing your heart, your spirit, your good thinking. Yeah, I guess in my own closing as well, joining with all of you, I'm thinking of a quote from Iñupiaq's Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. She talks about how Indigenous people have creation stories of how we've come to be in a place. We don't have colonization stories. We were born of these lands. Our languages were born and evolved from these lands. And within our languages and our practices and our songs and our dances and our ceremonies are the richest source of information about this place in our entire nation. The knowledge of this place is encoded within our languages. Thousands of years of knowledge of this place. And so because of that, protecting our languages should be something that everyone feels urgent, some urgency around. You know, somewhere along the way, we've required that students take 2 years of foreign languages in school, right? In their primary school. Why aren't we requiring Indigenous languages? The languages of the place. That would be incredible. Investing in Native languages. And while I'm saying that, I will also say that Native people should never, ever have to pay for what has been taken from us through the education system. We should not have to pay for language classes in our people's languages. We should not have to pay to learn our people's history through an institution that's complicit in taking it from us. That is unjust. We've paid so many times over and we continue to pay. And so that's one tangible thing I would like to say is in terms of what can be done is immediately finding a way to ensure that Native people are not paying to reclaim what the system has been complicit in taking from us. Also, to teach the truth. There were questions coming through about what are ways that we can build better relationships with Native people. Encountering the institutional legacy where you're at and actually examining that legacy and how it continues to show up today and teaching that is one piece. It's one part of that, because otherwise that additional burden that we spoke of in the very beginning of Native people being the ones to re-educate constantly in the face of defensiveness or anger about teaching the simple truths that we've experienced continues to be additional burden to us while we're reclaiming, while we're healing, while we're trying to do everything that everyone else is doing, raise our families, do what we need to do to be healthy and well, right? There's this invisible extra work that we're having to do while we're wiping clean this painted mirror. As Native people, we were handed a mirror that was painted by people who didn't love us. And it was enshrined in books, in journals, in media, and it continues to show up today. I would like to encourage folks to read Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Smith, our Maori auntie down from Aotearoa, if you haven't already. That's a really great one, as well as so many others, as well as encountering Indigenous people's words about our histories. Ayyu, Dr. Stern mentioned First Alaskans Institute, which is the nonprofit that I work for. We have two events coming up that are interrelated with the conversation we've been having today. One is around compacting education in Alaska, which is where our tribes will be able to assert control over our education systems within our communities and what that looks like and why that will yield a superior result to what we're experiencing. And to unpack this, we've invited Uncle Graham Smith from Aotearoa, Maori scholar, which I know many folks listening in really respect and value his good thinking, as well as many others, including Linda Smith, Hune, Dr. Twitchell, and others. If you go to the First Alaskans Institute Facebook page, you can find the live streams that we're having with our family about those conversations, as well as an upcoming tribunal space that we are going to host February 22 and 23 for our boarding school survivors. So we're creating space for the truths of our people's experiences to be told there. And so if you go to the First Alaskans Facebook page, that's a good way to get connected with all of it. And I think maybe the last little seed that I'll plant in terms of food for thought as folks are examining the systems in which we're operating and teaching and learning and growing. And that is, maybe asking the question, in which ways does our educational system continue to require assimilation of Native peoples in order for them to succeed? Because these education systems don't currently reflect our knowledge, our people's knowledge of, this place or how to be a real human being in this world, effectively we're being measured constantly on how far away from our own knowledge we are. And that's labeled as success. And so maybe that's a question that can be asked. In what ways are we continuing to require that Native students move further away from their own knowledge and their own people's histories in order to achieve success in this system and build better relationship with Native peoples and Native communities? So much more to say. I'm glad that there are going to be a couple more sessions related to this topic and others that have come up through the chat, the questions that have been asked. And so I'd like to just express my gratitude to my family here on the screen for the incredible work that you do advocating for our Native people every single day, for the love that you put into our work. Kahuku, you were talking earlier about, our people who are just now reconnecting and maybe they don't understand yet, but need to, that it comes with a great deal of responsibility. We want our people to be connected to who they are because we are collective people. Every one of us were born with gifts that belong to our community. And I just want to honor the ways that each of you use your gifts for our people. I'm so thankful to each of you. So Qanigluk, thank you for allowing me to rope everyone into this conversation. At this point, I'll hand it over to Libby, who has some closing comments.
Well, I am, again, so thrilled that we got the chance to listen to these amazing thinkers, educators, human beings. from our beautiful land up here in Alaska. So much needs to be said. So much needs to be heard as people recognize suddenly Indigenous folks have come into the spotlight, maybe as a positive impact of learning of land acknowledgements. But there is thousands of years of knowledge and wisdom yet to be shared, hundreds of years of the experience of colonization to be shed. So we are just obviously scratching the surface here. I look forward to so much more. You mentioned events happening through First Alaskans. There are other events happening nationally and internationally on Indigenous issues. We have 2 coming up as part of a series from the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center. Look for a podcast in March and another workshop in April. There were tons of wonderful questions and comments that came through that we harvested. As Ayyu mentioned, this was an internal family conversation and we were privileged to get to hear it. Too often Indigenous voices and other folks' voices are diverted off by having to serve other interests. So it was wonderful to just be able to listen to the family conversation. We are harvesting what people shared. We will use it as the basis for future conversations. We will be sending out to all registrants the recording and some additional resources. So Koyanak, Gwinalshish, I just learned it, Musicho. Thank you to our amazing presenters. Can't thank you enough, actually. It was quite a Valentine for me to hear you. Thank you to our over 800 participants. We will be getting back to you. And thank you to everyone on the back end of this event. So I really do hope that this starts to help us move towards more equity for Indigenous peoples everywhere, for sure. Not just in our educational institutions, but in every aspect of our lives. So happy Valentine's Day. Thank you. See you again.